Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. John Heulsdonk. Hello there. We're going to open the scrapbook this evening to the story of one of Northwest's most fabulous characters, a man whose feats of strength are legendary, whose exploits along the wild fringe of the last frontier have made telling around campfires and in bunkhouses for half a century. The German immigrant who came to Grace Harbor 60 years ago to live a long and rich lifetime and to become known as the Iron Man of the Hoe. Yes, our story will be that of John Heulsdonk, the mighty, who wrote one of the most picturesque and colorful chapters in the story of Grace Harbor country and the Olympic Peninsula. So when Dick is taking his customary few seconds for our sponsor, we'll turn the page of our scrapbook to tell of the legendary doings of the pioneer, the Iron Man of the Hoe. The Middle West of the 1880s was a transient part of our nation. While it had been settled by Easterners who kept pushing to civilized rims of the frontier, there was a feeling among the residents of Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska when the 1880s began to run out, that the real opportunities lay farther to the west, that they had stopped short of the El Dorado their parents had sought when they moved from the east. Check the hotel registers and the sources of new families moving to Grace Harbor in the boom years of 1889 and 1890, and you'll find that they came from Kansas, Iowa, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Now, Iowa in 1889 was still considered a land of opportunity, and shortly before our story begins, the Heulsdonk family, German immigrants, had settled in a farming community in the tall corn state. There were several children, but the one we're interested in was the square-built lad named John, with Dutch determination and German perseverance. He was 21 in 1889, just old enough to be interested when a government survey party passing through his part of the country offered him a job as a surveyor's helper. The party was, he was informed, going to make a survey of some wild country up in the state of Washington. Young John Heulsdonk accepted the job, and in the spring of 1890, the party stopped in Port Angeles long enough to pick up a supply of smoking tobacco and then plunge into the wilderness over the old Lake Crescent Trail. It was an uncharted area. Some landmarks had been logged as far back as the first voyages of Robert Gray and Captain Vancouver. Mount Olympus had appeared on charts. Tatoosh was shown as a landfall bearing, but generally the inside of the wilderness was less known than the heart of Africa. Through the year of 1890, the survey party ran their chains and shot their elevations. And when the survey had been completed, the young surveyor's helper was convinced that this was the promised land. He wanted to put his roots down in one of the rich valleys that they had swamped through. He chose the valley of the Hoe River and staked out a homestead. With a gaze, he hand-hewed the timbers of his house. He cut sections of the spruce logs for chairs. He fashioned a crude table and built a stone fireplace. Then he had cleared a field and made his first planting. When the firewood was heaped under the shake roof of his shed, he hiked out of the forest and took a train back to Iowa. There were two reasons for his trip. One, to let his family know what had happened to him in the intervening 2 years, and to tell them of the rich lands of the Olympics. And secondly, there was his childhood sweetheart, Dora. He told the story of the Olympics to his family, married Dora, and returned west. And soon to follow would be his parents and his brother Henry. John Heulsdonk hired a freighter to lug a stock of provisions to the mouth of the Hoe River, where he picked up the cargo in a canoe and poled it 24 miles upstream to his home. Then he settled down in such contentment that would have seen civilization again only once in 38 years, the lifetime of a middle-aged man. And at the settlement that he called Spruce, where the mountain trails brushed close to the Hoh River and the canoe crossing was possible, he made a small speck of human habitation in the vast wilderness. His home was the post office. It was reached by the river route or could be found at the end of a 25-mile trail over the footlands from the little settlement at Forks. But the scant handful of travelers that found the cabin over the years came to know it as the center of the Olympic Mountains hospitality. 4 children, all daughters, came to keep the woodmen hustling for wood and cash for their necessities, but John Heulsdonk was equal to the task. He hunted. His trap lines paid off in the winter's catch of valuable furs, and during the summer season he packed for the Forest Service or the Geological Survey that made infrequent trips into the hills. To take full advantage of the short summer season, he could pack for the government. He offered to carry double loads for double wages, and good packers could handle 100 pounds over the steep trails of the Olympic foothills. But John Heulsdonk carried 200 pounds and drew twice the wage of any other packer in the mountains. It was this remarkable strength that earned him the name that he would bear for a lifetime, the Iron Man of the Hoh. In other seasons, John farmed his clearing in the valley. There was stock to feed, which means fields of oats and hay. There were kids to feed, which meant turnips and corn. The furnishings of the house were simple at first, but Dora knew that as long as the spruce logs were in the kitchen, there'd never be any other chairs. So one spring she patiently rolled each of the short sections into the woods behind the house and hoped that it would suggest that it was time for John to go to Port Angeles or down to Hoquiam to purchase chairs for the house. Instead, John patiently rolled each section back. For the next 2 years, the logs wore a path in the woods as they were rolled back and forth. But finally the process wore down even the Iron Man of the Hoh. He built a rocking chair out of vine maple, bent it just right to the condors. It was the first piece of furniture in the house after the crude table that he had built. There were other ways of life that visitors thought crude, but that were routine on the frontier of the New West. The soft wheat grown in the short season was ground to crude flour in a coffee mill. The slabs of hogback were smoked to a fragrant mellowness over the smoldering vine maple fires. Cream became butter, and milk cheese as Dora's self-sufficiency asserted itself. Once a month, John took a canoe to the mouth of the river for a couple of supplies or hiked the long trail over to Forks. He was on his way home with a load strapped to his back when he met a forest ranger who brought out one of the most enduring stories of the great frontiersman. John was hiking up the forest trail with a new cast iron stove strapped onto his backboard. The ranger gasped at the sight of the man striding along with such a backful. "Isn't that too much for you?" he asked John. "No," John told him. "But the stack of flour in the oven keeps throwing the load out of balance." Not only did his pack have the stove on his back, but more than one settler paid John Heulsdonk cash money to have him carry in their heavy equipment. 15 summers and winters went by before Dora impressed John with the need for going outside to see what was going on. The Spanish-American War had been fought and was history. The Panic of 1907 has blown across the nation unfelt in the wilds of the Olympics. President McKinley fell to the assassination bullet, and then came the Alaskan Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle. The Northwest was agog over the big show to be staged at the site of the present University of Washington campus. Dora was now insistent, and for the only time in 37 years, the Heulsdonks trekked down out of the mountains in their Sunday best and took the ferry from Port Angeles over to Seattle to see the exposition. When the girls, there were 4 of them, grew old enough to attend college, John packed a few more pounds on each load and took a few more pelts from his trap. Every one of the 4 had a college education. That was Dora's idea. There was opportunity, too, for a man with John's ability, and in 1914 the government began to build trails through the mountains. John bent his strong back under the heavy loads to carry the men into the Olympics. It was the work of raising a family in the primitive surroundings, America's last wilderness, all on the broad shoulders of John. Dora became known as the best cook in the mountains. The hospitality of the Heulsdonks was famous from Nia Bay to the Enchanted Valley, and Dora was a good mother for her 4 girls. They grew up running as wild as the birds of the mountains through the trackless wilderness. They made summer pocket money and helped with their college expenses by catching elk calves for shipment to other ranges and for sportsman show. It was in 1929 when John got the urge to come to town again. He had been discussing with the Seattle Fair, he told friends, and had never wanted to go out of the mountains again. But in 1929, the Northern and Union Pacific Railroads announced that they would build a railroad onto the mountains as far as the whole river to bring timber out. It meant opening up the last wilderness, which was now tapped by its first highway. Grays Harbor celebrated with a grand jubilee in the Aberdeen Armory. There were speeches, tall eating, and great prophetic prophecies made. John came to hear and went back again, disgusted with the news and the ways the outside world. He paid just one call before he went back, on the neighbor who he had never met. Samuel Ben was the man, and the 2 posed for their picture together. Then John Heulsdonk went back to the Hoh to spend the rest of his life in the wilderness that he had conquered with his strong back and 2 good hands. And now, Dick, a few words from our sponsor. It was in 1946 John became ill. He was now 78, and a doctor in Forks told him that he would have to go to the hospital. Against his wishes, he was taken to Port Angeles, where on October 25th, the great trailblazer laid down his last load. He had been sick just a week in his life. When he was 66, he had been attacked by a bear while strolling in the woods, knocked down, and with the wild animal tearing at his flesh, his cougar dog, Tom, had fought off the animal until the pioneer could get his gun and dispatch the huge beast. It took him only a week to recoup his strength, the strength that won him the name, the Iron Man of the Hoh, and which made him a legend in this, our hometown scrapbook. Thank you for listening.